In this lecture, we are going to make the transition to modernity, starting with the ideas of a political theorist named Niccolò Machiavelli. And it might be important to give a recap of what we've talked about so far by thinking of common questions today that we still have that are really the deep philosophical questions that these early theorists were thinking about, such as the question of what is the good life. We've looked at four thinkers so far. We've looked at Plato, we've looked at Aristotle, we've looked at Augustine, and we've looked at Aquinas. Each of them are trying to come up with an answer to this question. And if you want to just think of a basic answer that most people would give today, such as the life that I want to live is I want to have a great family, live in a great city, and belong to a great country. These first theorists that we've looked at are really trying to give that answer. I think all of them would agree with that. But the question is, how do you make that actually happen? That is the question of politics. When they're talking about virtue in the state, they're trying to figure out how to make that happen. And all of these thinkers so far would say that at some point, if you want to have a great family, live in a great city, belong to a great country, you need other people to play their part because you can't create the ideal world by yourself. Now, if you ask, is there a correct part to play? These thinkers argue yes, there is a correct part to play. They disagree with the sophist idea that there is no such thing as truth, there is no such thing as justice. These early thinkers say that justice, virtue, and truth do exist, which means there is a correct part to play. But now that leads to the question of, can we coerce other people into playing their part? And this is where you have the development of two traditions up until this point as we're transitioning into modernity. You have the Aristotelian line of thinking, which argues that the state is the institution that's responsible for virtue formation. Now, the state, by its very nature, is coercive, which means it has the ability to create laws that compel people to do something, oftentimes or sometimes against their wishes. To have coercive power means that you can develop consequences for people who don't obey the laws. You can put them in jail, or you could do something worse. But there is some sort of coercive justice in the Aristotelian system when it comes to virtue formation. The Augustinian tradition argues that the state is not able to create virtue. Instead, that involves a different institution for Augustine, that is the church, but you could imagine it being something else. There is some other institution that doesn't take up the sword, that doesn't take up the coercive ability to make people do things that they don't necessarily want to do. There's another institution that is responsible for virtue formation, and that is the Augustinian tradition. Now, these two traditions have different thinkers later in the modern philosophical world. Thomas Aquinas, who we've already looked at, follows the Aristotelian tradition in that he argues that the state does have some role in creating virtue in citizens. And so even though Thomas Aquinas is a Christian, just like Augustine, where they differ is Augustine says that's not the state's job to create virtue, that's the job of the church or some other institution. Aquinas says, no, the state has some role in that. And so when we create laws, we are trying to form virtue in people. John Winthrop is another thinker who falls into this tradition, though we're not going to be looking at him in this class, but he has a famous quote that you may have heard of before, that we want to build a city upon a hill. That's Winthrop, and he's following this tradition that the state has some role to create virtue in its citizens. Following the Augustinian traditions are people like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, who in many ways look very different than Augustine, but they do buy into the idea that the state is not in the business primarily of forming virtue. That's not the institution of the state. It has a different purpose. And for Augustine, that purpose was to restrict evil. For Hobbes and Locke, they're going to be talking about the purpose of the state in a similar way, but using different language. Now, as we transition into modernity, one of the things that many of the political theorists are starting to realize is that we need to take a step back, and we need to start asking the big question, why do we have government? So if politics is learning how to live with one another, why do we have a government to set up the political world that we live in, or to enforce the political world that we live in? Well, you have some thinkers at this point that will make an argument that politics is just about coercive power. It's not about virtue formation. And these thinkers are going to say that even those who are trying to create virtue through the government, really they need to realize that what they're doing is they're just trying to grab onto power. That's what the state is primarily about. That's what government is primarily about, is those who are in control have the power. They get to set the rules, and they get to enforce those rules upon the majority. Which, of course, brings up the question, why in the world would anyone ever agree to be governed then? Why would they ever want to obey authority? Why wouldn't people want to just be free to do the things that they want to do? And you have a number of thinkers who are giving an answer to that question when you get into the modern world. You have Thomas Hobbes, again, who we're going to be looking at in a later lecture. In his Leviathan, he starts talking about this idea of the state of nature. This is the state of life before you have civilized society, before you have a government. And he starts to ask questions, what is life like in the state of nature, where there are no rules, where there is no government? Well, you have a world where people really do whatever they want to do. If you want to take someone else's property, you can take their property. And in the state of nature, the strong will survive. So why would people ever organize into a government? Well, it protects all people. Whenever you set up a government, it protects all people, especially those who are the most vulnerable. John Locke agrees with the idea of the state of nature, and then he builds his ideas upon Thomas Hobbes. And he argues that people want to form governments to protect life, liberty, and property. And again, in a later lecture, we'll look at the ideas of John Locke. And then you have thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who takes the idea of the state of nature in a different direction. And he argues that natural man in the state of nature is actually the moral man. It's society that corrupts people. And we're going to look at Rousseau later as well. But all of these thinkers are entering a new way of thinking or talking about political philosophy. And their ideas are kicked off by Niccolò Machiavelli. And so for Machiavelli, to understand his political thought, there are a few things that are important to understand. So first, his view of human nature. He argues that people are generally self-interested, ungrateful, deceitful, and driven by fear or ambition. Now, in some ways, he agrees with Augustine when it comes to the idea of original sin. He does think, though he doesn't use that phrase, he does think that people are sinful, but he disagrees with many of the Christian political theorists before him who are trying to create Christian virtue in government and in among its citizens, because he thinks that's just not real. Like, you can't make people virtuous. And since you can't make people virtuous, politics can't be about morality or virtue. It's about getting things done. Sometimes a ruler might need to, quote, do evil, as a Christian might say, to preserve the state. And so a lot of times Machiavelli gets a bad rap when starting to talk about his ideas, because he will promote sometimes a brutal type of ruler. But I think Machiavelli would ask the question, do you really want a ruler or a president or a governor who's just nice? Or do you want somebody who is effective, who gets things done? Yes, maybe they need to lie. Yes, maybe they need to cheat. But if it gets the job done, that's the type of ruler that we need.